Before I begin, I'd like to say a few words about the reason I'm standing here today in place of Belinda Brown. Last month, Belinda's husband, Jeff Dench, sadly passed away. Belinda and Jeff made a unique partnership, and we've all benefited from their extraordinarily fruitful marriage. She, one of the most distinctive and original voices in British life, has always acknowledged how much she owes to him, and by all accounts, she left a similar impression on him when he was well. And when he wasn't, he received from her the most dedicated and loving care that anyone has ever received from a spouse. I'm sure I speak for everyone here in sending love to Belinda and her family at this time. And I also just want to say that I'm very sorry that Professor Eric Anderson isn't here today. My talk is going to clash with what he said yesterday, and I would have been interested to discuss our differences, maybe another time. But for the record, feminism is not votes for women, that's democracy, and feminism is not equal pay, that's egalitarianism. We would have had both without feminism, and a lot less garbage between. On with the show. We're living in interesting times. Feminist entrenchment in many sectors is yielding toxic fruit. With the equal pay vanguard securing equal salaries for women responsible for unequal work with men in similar positions, increasing censorship and attacks on personal freedoms of women as well as men, and the Me Too anti-harassment movements claiming innocent scalps and even lives. However, opposition to feminism is undoubtedly growing, and with some more nurturing, this diverse, non-feminist sector could well become an operable political force. Before I explore some of the myriad ways feminist aggression is causing harm, I think it's important to define the critical term, feminism. In his 1913 volume, The Fraud of Feminism, Ernest Belfort Bax identified two distinct sides to feminism: an articulate political and economic side embracing demands for so-called rights, end quote. This was entirely legitimate in the context of the time the book was written. The other side, though, was a sentimental side which insists on an accentuation of privileges and immunities, end quote. As this audience will be well aware, there remain no legal rights in the modern Western world afforded to men and not to women. So, the modern feminist movement can only be and is only concerned with protecting and expanding upon privileges and immunities. We saw it here in the UK in late June when Justice Secretary David Gauke announced that plans for new women's prisons would be scrapped. Instead, women's centres for rehabilitation will be built to provide women with a range of resources to help them steer their lives back on track within their communities, in line with tireless campaigning from feminist individuals and groups. I do not dispute the efficacy of the strategy. I hope it works. However, the UK criminal justice system already treats women preferentially, and the fact that meanwhile plans for new men's prisons are proceeding is emblematic of the disparity in treatment of offenders based on their sex. In addition, with incessant feminist projects to increase female representation in attractive positions and to empower women to destroy the lives of men at a whim, we can see that feminism is a project to increase the power of women with no clearly understood limit or endpoint. In the words of Belfort Bax, feminism seeks to position women as a dominant sex noblesse. Therefore, feminism is a female supremacy movement. Feminism is also a fraud, as evidenced by their false narratives on suffrage, as evidenced by their false statistics and narratives on wage gaps, rape and domestic violence, and as evidenced by their utter contempt for many of the women they claim to represent. Finally, feminism is a hate movement, which has always embraced not only gynocentrism, but also misandry. We can see it in the pioneering Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls in 1848, which claims that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And in Christabel Pankhurst's 1913 book, The Great Scourge, in which she said that men were little more than carriers of venereal disease. Today it can be seen in the pronouncements of many mainstream feminist thinkers. Susanna Danuta Walters recently asked, "Why can't we hate men? We have every right to hate you." A segment on ABC's Tonightly with Tom Ballard programme featured women sarcastically thanking men in general for drugging and raping women. And Laurie Penny announced in response to the Capital Gazette massacre that we must not allow our society to be held hostage to white male fragility any longer. The addition of the descriptor white to male is a common tactic used with increasing frequency intended to make feminist bigotry invulnerable to attack. A couple of days ago, Barack Obama complained that men have been getting on my nerves lately. I just think, brothers, what's wrong with you guys? What's wrong with us? I mean, we're violent, we're bullying. So that's feminism. And this is how feminist aggression causes harm. Feminism is a threat to liberty. Freedom is a good in itself, not a means to an end. John Stuart Mill argued in On Liberty that society can and does execute its own mandates, and if it issues wrong mandates instead of right, or any mandates at all in things with which it ought not to meddle, it practices a social tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression, since, though not usually upheld by such extreme penalties, it leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. We gradually internalised this wisdom in the UK, leading to the 20th century in which we made solid social advances. In 1959, a defence against the charge of obscenity on the grounds of literary merit was introduced, which was successfully applied to the Lady Chatterley's Lover case against Penguin Books in 1960. This laid the foundation for a vast expansion in freedom to publish explicit material. The pill was introduced in 1961, and legislation affecting strip clubs was also liberalised during the 1960s. Accompanying these developments were concurrent advancements in social attitudes, and these freedoms gained still apply to us in 21st century Britain, but we have Puritan authoritarians, overwhelmingly in the shape of feminists, trying to drag us backwards. These feminists in the last 3 years in the UK have managed to ban sexy ads from the tube and bus networks in London, stifle The Sun's Page 3 and many lads' mags, and to deprive grid girls and darts walk-on girls of their jobs. Universities are busy waging war on lad culture among their male populations, and now we're facing the prospect of unwelcome male advances towards women being classified as hate crimes. Such freedoms may seem trivial, but the value of autonomy should not be understated. Personal freedom is critical to meaning, and we must allow for freedom from the tyranny of feminist opinion. Feminism is a threat to justice. In recent decades, feminists have successfully promoted the idea of believing the victim in cases of alleged violence, harassment, or sexual misconduct by men against women, regardless of available evidence. In the words of Lena Dunham, things women don't lie about, rape. This subjective reasoning has led to campus rape trials in kangaroo courts across the US, Australia, and Canada. They've been advocated for here in the UK, but thankfully remain to be implemented. They're governed by amateurs with inadequate legal training who are given license to adjudicate with the lowest possible standards of evidence, bordering on no evidence at all. With this trend, we are witnessing a move away from the long-standing legal principle of innocent till proven guilty and toward the dangerous principle of guilty till proven innocent, paving the way for the systematic ruination of innocent lives. Plenty of feminists think that this is a good plan. Under Feminist Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, the UK's Criminal Prosecution Service became embroiled in a scandal wherein targets set for rape and sexual assault prosecutions encouraged police forces to withhold exonerating evidence from courts. Innocent men were incarcerated, that's a fact, and as a rule, their victimisers have retained anonymity and avoided their own well-deserved sentences for perjury. Thankfully, all rape and sexual assault cases are currently under review to ensure that evidence has been disclosed. There is a grossly unjust distribution of resources, typically awarded by courts ruling on divorce cases. The UK is unusual in having no explicit proportional, total or time limits for maintenance awards. This system incentivises wives to seek divorce, hence women initiate 2/3 of proceedings. Whilst the wishes of women are often of paramount importance in divorce courts, the well-being of men and children are often an irrelevance. Now, as I mentioned, the UK is facing the extension of hate crime legislation to include the charge of misogyny. In line with current hate crime legislation, the charge will require no evidence of hateful motivations, but rather be governed by the perception of the victim or any witnesses. This shameful waste of police time will offer another avenue for malicious women to use the law to harm innocent men, as well as diverting precious resources from the fight against actual crime. And don't think that these crimes won't be acted upon by sensible officers. A perception of indifference from the police in such circumstances will be treated, as it is with current hate crimes, as secondary victimisation, with Greater Manchester Police clarifying that action will be taken against police accused of indifference towards victims, and whether or not it is reasonable for them to perceive it that way is immaterial. End quote. Family courts have been infested with feminist ideology too, resulting in fathers routinely being cast out of their homes and having their relationships with their children destroyed, even whilst being held responsible for their financial requirements. Then there is the gender justice gap for those convicted of crimes, which we'll hear more about from Jordan Holbrook tomorrow. Sex discrimination in the UK criminal justice system has a long history. For example, flogging as a punishment for female criminals was banned in 1820, but continued for men until 1967. Presently, men account for around 95% of the total prison population, despite only committing 3.4 times more crimes than women. Factors that explain this disparity include a greater percentage of convicted men being sentenced to prison, men being given longer sentences on average than women, women being paroled earlier than men, despite being more likely to be disciplined for bad behaviour whilst incarcerated, and women being more likely to have mitigating factors such as age, dependence, lack of previous relevant convictions, and the appearance of genuine remorse applied to their sentences. Feminist activists such as Women in Prisons, Baroness Corsten, and Julie Bindel have committed themselves to widening the gender justice gap enabled by myopic and sentimental authorities. Feminism is a threat to meritocracy. The cultural obsession with the gender pay gap is driven by disingenuous, authoritarian feminists with no regard for personal choice, meritocracy, or human well-being. The focus is exclusively on the mythical glass ceiling, with no interest paid to the fate of those men employed in the glass cellar, dangerous and dirty jobs that women don't want, who are increasingly at risk of unemployment due to automation, as well as the ever-present risks of workplace injury and death. Quotas are being used by many organisations which discriminate against men, sometimes Caucasian men specifically. This is not only immoral in that it unfairly disadvantages individuals, but also frankly stupid, with the potential to impair the functioning of sectors rejecting meritocracy and therefore the economy and society in general. Battles are being fought to acquire equal pay for women performing similar or even sometimes dissimilar roles to their male counterparts, regardless of relevant facts such as whether they work fewer hours. For example, the BBC's former China editor, Kerry Gracie, was awarded £280,000 in back pay to bring her earnings in line with John Sopel, the North America editor, despite the fact that his job was more intensive and he was on air significantly more than her. She's donated her payout to the Fawcett Society. There are also several battles raging to secure equal pay for mainly female supermarket store workers as mainly male warehouse workers. An Asda spokesman clarified, in response to coverage consistently suggesting otherwise, that at Asda, hourly paid colleagues doing the same job in the same location are paid the same. Men and women doing the same job in our retail stores are paid the same. Men and women doing the same job in our distribution centres are paid the same. Pay rates in stores differ from pay rates in distribution centres for legitimate reasons. End quote. Differences in comfort, exertion and safety in the roles have been labelled as entirely illegitimate reasons to offer different levels of pay to workers in the coverage of the stories. Unfortunately, the courts look likely to agree. Feminism is a threat to men. Feminism attacks male-only spaces and male interests. Traditionally, male and female-only spaces have existed as the norm in every culture. Men hunted together, explored together, and enjoyed ritual space that allowed men and fathers and sons to bond. Later, they would create numerous social clubs and guilds. During the last 30 years, though, a monumental shift has happened, which has seen doors to venues that offer male space nailed shut or rendered strictly unisex, thanks to equalities legislations that feminists have worked so hard to institute, and which are conspicuously only ever applied to male space, never female space. It's now literally illegal for men to formally gather alone, a behaviour classed as oppressive to women. This mean and bitter assault on freedom of association is surely a barrier in the way of some men finding intimate and supportive networks of like-minded peers who could share experiences, have one another's backs, and express themselves freely. And that's probably why it's so important to the feminist project. Feminists have colonised and at least attempted to lobotomise video games, comics, rock music, action films, even Lads Mag Loaded, which closed down a year after they decided to be far more discerning and sophisticated in their depiction of women. Lad culture comes under sustained criticism, with the National Union of Students producing a report called That's What She Said, based on interviews with a whole 40 women. It cited negative attitudes towards feminism as being among the problematic behaviour associated with lads on campus, and sports and other extracurricular activities as being key sites where such behaviour arose. The report acknowledged that policy frameworks to tackle lad culture have had no impact on sexual assault rates where they've been pursued in US universities, and goes on to suggest policy frameworks to tackle lad culture in UK universities, apparently simply because they don't like it. Feminism attacks male behaviour and masculinity. regardless of whether a behaviour is innocuous or women engage in equivalent or even the same behaviour. If a man does anything, feminists oppose it. In the last few years, catchy feminist portmanteaus such as manspreading, mansplaining and manterrupting have proliferated and become ubiquitous in their use. The aim is to shame, silence and bludgeon men into compliance. Masculinity as a whole is vilified and demonised in our societies. The endeavour begins at school, intensifies at university and in the workplace increasingly, and reaches a tragic crescendo in family courts, where men are denied access to their children, who would bring such critically important meaning to their lives and be the ultimate expression of their masculinity. Feminism is a very direct threat to men's literal freedom, as I've already discussed. But the current state of affairs is not enough for some feminists who want to see men not guilty till proven innocent, but guilty upon accusation. Julie Lalonde, an expert brought into Ottawa University during the hysteria around a rape allegation that proved false to tackle the institution's rape culture, believes that every time we see a high-profile sexual assault trial result in an acquittal, it sends women back 50 years. Feminism is a threat to women. Feminists seek to dictate women's behaviour. They objectify women by rejecting their autonomy and deny them respect. Tolerance is a noble attitude to take that's consistent with living in a diverse and pluralist society, but the feminist preachers of tolerance exercise very little. They attack women who reject the feminist label and those who make the wrong choices, to be a cam girl, a stay-at-home mother, or a conservative, for example. Even those who do identify as feminist, but challenge mainstream feminist dogma. And feminism threatens its own female true believers. If you can convince a woman that she's disadvantaged, you make her so. At a meeting last April, Ealing Council's cabinet members decided to implement a buffer zone around their local abortion clinic, preventing protesters from the Good Counsel network from acting in the vicinity of the building. This is a violation of free speech, which must be opposed in its own merit and for the precedent it sets. But it is also far from the symbolic moment for women's rights that it is being billed as a condescending virtue signal inferring female weakness and depriving women of their right to be exposed to challenging ideas that may even affect one of the most important decisions of their lives. The Good Counsel Network reports that more than 500 women have changed their minds due to the efforts of the group in Ealing, and undoubtedly those women are eternally grateful to them. Other women may not get the chance, thanks to this feminist ban. Feminism is a threat to children, besides those never born thanks to feminist action. Boys and young men have been falling behind in an increasingly feminised education system for 30 years, whilst feminist-inspired policies to privilege women and girls proliferate. The statistics on the ever-widening gender gap in the primary and secondary school teaching profession, rates of male disengagement through expulsion and dropping out, and the gender gaps in university enrolment and attainment are well known. These issues present a situation where both individual boys and men are losing out, as well as wider society, which is missing out on the skills and qualities that we could be nurturing in the critical resource that the male section of our society represents. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the UK ratified in 1951, states that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. End quote. However, over the last half-century, many states, including the UK, have, at the behest of feminists, reneged on this commitment and attacked the family on many fronts, leading to adverse consequences for individuals, families, and societies itself. The The administration of the law in civil, divorce and family courts privileges mothers over fathers to the point of creating perverse incentives for women to break up their families. Many feminist charities and NGOs participate in this immoral state of affairs, and the everyday misandry prevalent in politics, the media, academia and advocacy demonises men, perpetuating a culture in which injustices are condoned. Family breakdown tends to lead to poor outcomes for men and women as well as children. These are reflected consistently in a range of statistics. An intact family is the greatest of privileges, one that we should want for all and that we should defend. Where families do split, it is, as a rule, vital that the role of fathers is preserved, with a presumption of shared parenting in family court rulings, rulings being upheld, and allegations in civil and family courts explored fully, with false allegations of mistreatment being punished. This will not happen so long as feminism dominates gender relations and family law. However chilling the impact of feminist aggression is, however, and how entrenched it is in our institutions and governance in many countries, feminism is a crumbling bastion for a delusional minority of the global community. Diligent work by activists and academics for over a century, as well as maniacal and disgusting overreach by feminists themselves, really seem to be causing ripples right now. It is imperative that we maintain the momentum and see to it that people do take sides, present the facts, make the case, and then seek an answer to the key question: are you a feminist or are you not a feminist? And if somebody has difficulty answering, let's pose the following questions, originally proposed by Fiedelbogen. Do you think it's a good idea to drive a wedge down the middle of the human race and alienate men and women from each other? Do you think it's a good idea to insinuate that most of the world's problems flow from a male source? Do you think it's a good idea to treat woman-hating as a felony, but man-hating as a social misdemeanor? Do you think it's a good idea to encourage the growth of fatherless families? Do you think it's a good idea to prop up your political agenda with false statistics? Do you think it's a good idea to corrupt the criminal justice system with anti-male ideological bias? Do you think it's a good idea to empower women with no clear limits and no stipulations about using that power responsibly? Do you think it's a good idea to insult and slander men and women of conscience who disown feminism or say stiff things about it? Finally, do you think it's a good idea to pretend that feminism bears no relation to any of the things we've listed here? And as we reach a critical mass of people who are secure in their position on the question and proud to declare that I am a non-feminist, everybody will appreciate that feminism is a paper tiger and be motivated to force a change of course for our societies, knowing unequivocally that the feminist road leads to hell. Feminist confidence will erode and non-feminist citizens will be emboldened to nail the coffin on the feminist problem. Then we can progress. With an activated non-feminist sector, we can secure our liberty, justice, meritocracy, support our men, women and children. The collapse of feminist hegemony at the hands of the non-feminist revolution will give rise to better people in better societies living better lives. Human beings will always be flawed, but we can move towards a state where men and women can move past the acrimonious spectacle of gender competitiveness and rediscover the meanings of trust, common purpose, and teamwork. Children will be raised with truth, selflessness, humility, and meaningful relationships with two parents. Power struggles between the sexes can be replaced with love. If you feel so inclined and you haven't already, please join me and the other signatories in taking a public stand against feminism by signing the Non-Feminist Declaration, available at nonfeminist18.wordpress.com. Thank you.
Hi, how much do you think modern feminism is connected with Marxism and radical left thinking?
Oh, I mean, intrinsically, yeah. You know, I have spent time talking to feminists in real life and on feminist Facebook groups. And what's endlessly entertaining is the amount of misogynistic comments and memes they will share based on conservative women. Conservative women don't count. So yes.
They openly admit being Marxists. They will say to you, we are Marxists.
A lot of them will, yeah. Certainly socialist, there's no shame in that, but conservative feminists have a really hard time. And if you look at, women like Julia Hartley-Brewer, she's actually a feminist. I have no idea why. I've spoken to her about it. And we had to agree to disagree in the end, although she didn't refute any of my points. But she is, endlessly abused by most mainstream feminists. And they will disown her and try to tell her that she's not a feminist. So,
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you. There was one point in it. Can I just clarify? You said that it is now illegal for men to gather only as men.
Formally.
Sorry?
Formally.
Formally?
Yeah.
So, if I want to be part of a men's group in a formal way, is that illegal now?
I think you would run into problems if a complaint was made and there would potentially be a legal avenue for feminists to force you to admit women. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that is what I gather.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. About this question of Marxism, it depends on what you mean by Marxism. But if you say cultural Marxism, then we know that in the years around 1970, there was an influence from cultural Marxism, from the Frankfurt School, etc., on the new second wave feminism. And one main feature was the aim was to destroy the nuclear family.
Family, exactly.
Yes, and it could be said more openly that this is at the core of second wave feminism, that is to destroy the family in order to undermine capitalist society.
Absolutely. 100% agree.
Hello? Oh, okay, yeah. I arrived a little bit late, so forgive me if I did miss anything. But I do have to question just how much can we blame the label of feminism for everything that seems to be what I would say a natural woman's inclination to gain privilege, as opposed to the actual movement giving them that medium to do so. Because I watch a lot of Paul Elam and I do watch a lot of Warren Farrell, and they look a lot deeper rather than looking at the label. They look at the intentions of women in particular. So I wonder just how much would you gain from getting rid of a movement when it just seems to be the intrinsic nature of women to gain privilege wherever it's available?
Okay, well, I wouldn't just blame women. I would say that men have an intrinsic desire to be gynocentric and to give women those privileges. But yeah, we are a gynocentric species, but what feminism has done is that it has weaponized the gynocentrism And, Peter Wright has written a really good book called something like, well, it's called Gynocentrism. I've forgotten this kind of subtitle or the tag. But he identifies a movement from the late Middle Ages, which some feminists have identified as proto-feminism. And basically what happened was that, wealthy, privileged women took the chivalric code, which originally governed relations between men and other men, and they applied it so it governed relations between men and women. And they did it by demonizing men and taking the worst, excesses of, things that sort of predatory males did and saying this is what all men do and we have to control them to stop them, raping us and doing all these terrible things. And then we got to first wave feminism, and it takes like a massive kind of, it speeds up the process. And with every wave of feminism, the process of privileging women and disadvantaging men has just gone like this, So yeah, I think it would help a lot. And I think that although we're a gynocentric species and that, there are always going to be men prepared to sacrifice for the well-being of women. But I think that when you're looking at policy, like public policy, where people can sit down and think rationally, we need to be taking a different lens and, using our rational minds and pursuing equality. Go on.
Just on a quick note, do you not think that's a little bit dismissive of historical kind of like events, especially when you talk about how women have had, I guess, a chivalry throughout the past, and as pragmatic as that is, can we deny the fact that men have been quite privileged in the fact that they control women's sexuality throughout?
Not in comparison to women. Men and women of the same class, women have always been privileged over men, in my opinion. I mean, there were certainly limitations on what women could do, and I'm glad that those limitations no longer exist. Maybe we'll have a discussion later.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Hobson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.